Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. Today is April 6, 2025. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Please subscribe. Also want to thank Kathy Siegel Garcia for introducing me to today's guest, Taylor Hatch, for part 2. Where in the heck you calling in from, Taylor?
I'm currently in Davis, California.
How cool is that? I want to thank you for doing part 1. It was truly enlightening and fun. That's what I'm after, is fun. And, we were just talking in the green room about quotes, and you said this quote, seeing is believing. Now, I've heard that quote forever, and everybody's heard it. And you go, I don't know who said it. So the beauty is, I love to find out who, quote, investigator, or find out. And here it is. Seeing is believing, but feeling is truth. 17th century clergyman Thomas Fuller.
Wow.
So the fact that you quoted it was great, adding to the cliches of quotes everybody knows, seeing is believing. I mean, I went on this rant, and sorry, I go on so many rants with you. You're like so enthused. and a couple of years ago, though, it's no longer seeing is believing. Now it's believing is seeing.
Exactly.
So it flipped. But you made me research it, so I want to thank you there. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, the first question today is, can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
Oh my God. Most definitely. I mean, it's funny because I feel like I've always found ways to sort of trace memories back to when I was much younger. I mean, the earliest I certainly, especially being a musician, is my grandfather, who passed away years and years ago, back in 2007, he had an upright piano, which is now based in my childhood home in Arroyo Grande. And it's one of the earliest memories, but I certainly recall when my parents decided to, bring the piano in. I mean, probably just to preserve it, give it some life. But of course, me being a super young, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old. I mean, I was always banging on the piano just to, have fun with it, explore, be creative. And I mean, that's easily one of the earliest memories I have. And I'm sure there's always additional stuff like that always sort of pops into my mind in a nostalgic way that, of course, pertains to so much of my life and early development. So the piano certainly is one of them. And I actually have this is actually a photo that's in my bedroom, but and it's crazy too, because I'm actually staying with my uncle, who's also a musician, as a hobbyist. But there's a photo of my uncle Jason giving me my first guitar chords. Like, there's a photo of me when I was maybe 2 or 3 years old, and he's showing me my first 3 guitar chords, just outside. And my grandmother, who basically found the photo, pretty much just showed this to me. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, and she, of course, knew right away that I was destined to be a musician just after a small moment like that.
Wow, that's really good, because I'm going to skip some of these philosophical questions because I'm so eager to jump into music. But we'll follow through with a couple of these. Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Oh, man. It has to be a blessing, because it's like I said just now, there must be a very distinct connection with nostalgia. At least I think of it that way, where, I mean, yeah, memory certainly can be partially a curse depending on the experience, and perception is such a big thing in that regard. But I've always treated memory for me as a way to, remember some of the best moments that have occurred in my development, and how that impacts my direction is such a key thing, I think.
Yeah.
At least.
Beautiful. Tell me someone within your immediate family who had an impact on you, and what was that impact?
Oh my goodness. Only one individual?
Well, I mean, just to briefly highlight one.
Oh goodness. Wow. That's Man, I come from a very, I guess, eclectic family. So it's like every single member has something, very unique to offer. But I would definitely say that as far as me being a musician or definitely being an artist, my uncle Jason certainly is
Yeah,
one of those individuals, considering like, you know, I became I became a musician sort of by of course experimenting, but yet, was always nice to have someone in the family who was that skilled. Of course, he had played music in college and, was he started playing guitar, I assume, around the same time I sort of was. No, I was maybe a bit younger, but still, like I was always so like intrigued knowing that he was a musician, and so you know, and then he gave me my first acoustic guitar when I was 10 years old, and
nice.
that became, something so memorable on my end, just
Yeah.
having that influence.
Really good. Now, outside your immediate family, I know again there's many, but just one that stands out. Someone
Mm,
who had an impact on you, and what was that impact?
sure. Oh my goodness. It's so hard because as you can very well guess, Jerry, I have so many individuals that have played a significant role. But I'll say there's one person in particular. So when I was very young, I I mentioned this I think in the last show, but I was always obsessed with trains, and I was one of my absolute favorite things growing up with was Thomas the Tank Engine.
Yeah,
And so last December, Britt Allcroft, the woman who was responsible for creating the TV series, so she and I had a very, I would consider it a brief but beautiful connection. And we never got the chance to officially meet in person, but we had corresponded via email. And despite being, somewhat distant via the internet, I had introduced myself to her when I was around, I think I was a senior in high school at one point, because I casually just wanted to reach out and pick her brain about all things creativity and what she did as far as her experiences. And um, she, to many people within the Thomas fandom, was someone who really was dedicated to the the influence of imagination on children, and how that plays a significant role within expanding creativity and having this broad viewpoint of, and she even said this so perfectly, it's like, you can't decide the adventure or the destination, but it has to come to you.
yeah,
And that was something impactful. But then I remember just a few months back when I was traveling to LA, and I was helping some friends with moving some things, and I received a text from a friend of mine back up in the Central Coast, and she had mentioned, like, she first said to me, like, "Did you hear?" And my immediate instinct was, "There's no way that Brit is gone." And she sends me the text and like, "Britt Allcroft just passed away." And by that point, I was like, my world stopped for a minute. And I felt so, of course, I was devastated, but I instantly knew that, like, not just myself, but so many of us we were all just feeling the same amount of mourning and
yeah,
just absolute shock. And from what I remember hearing, her health was sort of challenged. They didn't specify, of course, her cause of death. Not that, it needs to be said, but I just, Britt has certainly been someone who was that impactful to me being a creative artist, but also the important thing too, and she even made a post about this on her Facebook, was she instantly knew the care of how Thomas the Tank Engine has impacted individuals on the autism spectrum, which, of course, I'm one of those. And, there's something very central about how the gift of imagination and creativity plays a significant role with different thinkers, and having that having that mindset is something that's stuck with me for a long while. And so I easily credit Britt for not only enhancing my childhood and giving me this reminder of how the creative space is something to witness and have this whimsical way of finding your true calling in any form of artistry.
Really, dude, you're so articulate and concise because you painted a picture. You don't just have synesthesia. You know how to paint pictures with words synesthesically.
Right.
I mean, it was really cool that, and I really appreciate what you did because it probably influenced you working. Don't you teach children music?
I do, yeah.
So there's a direct line. Now, did your parents raise you a particular religion?
I guess you could say, like, non-denominational, like, I guess Protestant, you could say. I don't practice it, but I think some of my morals kind of stemmed from that, but I don't practice it like Christianity in itself.
Do you pray?
Occasionally, but maybe more so as I don't know. I feel like in my case, there seems to be. I mean, I think on certain occasions, but I don't know. It's so hard to say. It's like, and it's no disrespect to anybody that worships any religion. It's just I think for me it's sort of spontaneous, and it has maybe different motives of, like, if I pray regarding something that's central in my environment or someone else's. So I think it varies.
Yeah. If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Oh man. And it's not like I'm deciding what God is going to say.
No, you're good. You're not. That's good. No one ever says that. I can't decide it, but it's more like, what would you like him to, or him, not what would you like
Right.
God to say?
Right. I mean, that's hard to say too, because, like, I wouldn't even know the first thing I would want him to say to me before I die, because I feel like,
Yeah. Being a musician, Taylor, I'm always waiting for one of you great musicians to go, dude, let's jam.
Yeah, honestly.
God says, let's go into the music room and jam.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I know it's a theme from last part one. Let's go in the music room and doodle.
Exactly. Just noodle our way through.
Oh, noodle. No, it's not doodle. It's noodle. Yeah. Okay. So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?
Right.
Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Yeah, that's a really valid point. It's also like this is something that's certainly hinted to me by, I've mentioned this already, how perception is just such a key thing.
Yeah.
In experience. I feel like that's also the kind of thing that I've noticed a lot of artists they resonate with that so much, because everybody's form of experiences and perception are so unique to the individual. And I do find that, at least I get creative fascination knowing that there are different kinds of avenues of how people perceive different kinds of experiences and information that either give me some kind of reason to think about it in a way, not overly like overthink about, like, choosing a set pathway or anything, but it's also, I think it comes from an open curiosity about how recreation can either be something that is so direct to an audience versus if it's solely because like there's a distinct connection between like the fascination of it. I think of it especially like how, you know, you go anywhere and you're watching a play or some kind of performance. You know, every actor is different. Every person playing a significant character either has um you know, the either the proper way of displaying that one character versus if some people are used to like a Broadway production of something, then you know, if you listen to the soundtrack long enough or you're familiar with the stage production, there's always that kind of direct connection between like how one perceives it and then the recreating of it is always like they can remember scene by scene and note for note, and that becomes such a memory booster for those people. So that's something I've been, I mean, it's a perfect example too, because like, you know, I'm on tour with some of these theater companies in the Bay Area and like, you know, watching each production and getting the sense of like how the script lines up with the music
Yeah.
is, I mean, that's, I kind of have like it's all jogged in my memory bank after many rehearsals and many times performing.
Really good, Taylor, because we're going to just jump into this now. What was the tipping point when you kind of decided that music was your calling? Because, you know, you're banging on the piano as a 3-year-old. Uncle Jason gives you a guitar at 10. You're
Mhm.
surrounded by music. And, you know, I'm sure your parents are playing music around the house. You're hearing it.
Right.
And then, you know, did you study music instruments right away, taking lessons? And when was it where you go, this is going to be my job? You know,
Mm.
this is going to be, you know, not also much your job, because, you know, being a musician, like, you know, the great joke is, what's the difference between a folk musician and a pizza? Pizza feeds a family of 4.
Sure, exactly.
But, you know, it's like, did your parents ever go, now, Taylor, you got to have something to fall back on, because you ain't going to make your living being, but I mean, you make your living being a musician, but you're also an educator, blah, 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 you know. And
Right.
it's like my friend Ben Manikin, you got to see his film. It's on YouTube for 10 minutes. Who Killed Jazz? It's just
Okay.
basically, you know, how people don't want to pay musicians what they deserve. Like, oh, you can just play for free, can't you? Oh, we'll give you a drink.
Yeah, that's all the
We'll,
compensation you can get.
yeah, yeah, we'll give you. But I mean, where was it? Where's that tipping point? You says, this is my calling.
I think it was ultimately around, I mean, as young as I've been learning music, uh, I mean, really, it was somewhere in my younger years after just, you know, I became so interested in because I was taking music classes even when I was younger and I was going to so many concerts. I think it must have been at least at one point after I received the acoustic guitar that my uncle gave me, and you know I was dabbling with it, and I didn't. Of course, I wasn't as experienced with it, but then I took lessons further in my teens, and I was fortunate enough to have a great teacher that only lived like a small block away from my childhood home, so it was an easy walk just to get
Yeah.
to his place and just jam and learn music and all that. And even by that point, it was like I was solely like listening to like some of the more pivotal artists that became influential to my, I guess, to my guitar development was John Mayer, which for a lot of people, especially I guess in my generation, like John Mayer's music was always that was the hot shit that was out there in the early 2000s, and everybody was trying to sound like him or have a direct connection between how he was playing. But
Yeah.
my dad introduced me to Eric Clapton, and then I through John Mayer I discovered Stevie Ray Vaughan. But the crazy thing too is when I was younger, somewhere between 7 or 8, like I was listening to Vince Guaraldi and Pat Metheny, but
Yeah.
I didn't think of the actual label of their music to be jazz at that
Yeah.
point. I was just, I remember too, because like I think it was either my first, one of the first CDs I ever bought, or maybe my parents bought it for me, was a Charlie Brown Christmas with all the tracks from Vince Guaraldi.
Yeah.
And that technically became sort of my youngest like introduction to jazz.
Yeah.
Until, you know, I was taking like, you know, I was taking guitar lessons in my teens and finally learning like different ways to play jazz standards at a
Yeah.
young age. And then, but I guess the tipping point for me has, I think it was just sort of ongoing, because as long as I've been playing and learning music, it's like, you know, even when I was younger, I was always like singing around the household. So maybe it was like sort of an instant realization to my parents that music was always going to be central in my life.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it
So
was sort of,
cool.
yeah, I think it was ongoing in my case. And
Yeah, that's so cool, because you evoke two things. My sister brought home Led Zeppelin 2 from college,
mhm.
and I was like, "Whoa!" And my friend around the block said, "That's the blues."
Oh, really?
And I was like, "Whoa! If that's blues, I like it." And then you know, jazz was the same thing. When Herbie put out Chameleon, which you know, Headhunters,
Of
but they
course.
go, "That's jazz," and we go, "Damn! If that's jazz, we love it." Now I knew I was hearing jazz, but I didn't know I was really hearing jazz, because my parents were playing American musicals around the house all the time. And
Same.
Gershwin and Cole Porter are jazz in a lot of ways, but we
Yeah,
don't call them jazz, you know. So it's
exactly.
funny you were going, I didn't know Vince and Pat were jazz. And that, isn't that beautiful? You don't know the genre, you're just hearing music.
Exactly.
And so let's just cut to the chase. You know, you go on YouTube and you see this piece that you put up in January of this year. Everything starts from a dot.
Right.
Taylor, that is brilliant. You composed and arranged a piece.
I
The
did.
the visuals are so amazing, but just your solo, the piano soloing, and the woman is not singing words. Is that correct? She's just singing
Yeah, it's
sound.
wordless
It's
vocals. Yes.
wordless vocals, but you composed it with
Mhm.
notes and you told her to sing, not words.
Exactly.
It's brilliant. And I really loved it. And
Thank
I'm going to go right to the chase. So a screenwriting teacher told me great film is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker.
you. Mm.
Kubrick says a great film is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What
Mhm.
role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing an original Taylor piece? It's not a commission. It's
Right.
not an assignment. It's like is that what everything starts from a dot? Was that a commission, or just totally wrote it on your own?
So that piece entirely was written on my own, and the setting that you're watching it in was from my senior recital at the University of North Texas. So, and there's sort of an interesting story behind that, because I, during my last year at North Texas, which wasn't that long ago, this was last May, I was taking composition lessons and jazz guitar lessons at the same time. But when I was taking lessons with the great Andrew May, which to this day, he's been one of the most influential composition teachers I've ever had, he encouraged me to explore pieces by Vasily Kandinsky. And it was sort of like this osmosis experience, like a light bulb moment for me, because I watched a YouTube video. It was by a guy named Christian Swenson, who is I think he's a professor at BYU, but he's also on the autism spectrum. He posted this video about Kandinsky, and he had basically talked about the fact that Kandinsky was synesthetic and potentially had, at least at that time, because you couldn't diagnose it, that he potentially had autism as well. So when I was conceptualizing Everything Starts from a Dot, I was taking composition lessons with Andrew May, and he had encouraged me to, and this all ties into the conception of the piece. Like I was reading a lot about Kandinsky. I had bought The Spiritual Life and Art, that main book that was, you know, one of the pinnacle titles of Kandinsky's documented work. And so
I got it on my shelf.
of course on my Kindle somewhere, but this was when I felt like my compositional directory, like my direction was focusing solely on audio visual components that didn't necessarily fall into the jazz world traditionally, but yeah. I composed the piece solely because I knew for my recital I wanted to project this merge between music and intermedia / audio visual components. So that piece ended up being an experiment where I knew that I wanted to break the rules when it came to the standards that the UNT jazz program laid out on me as far as what to do in a traditional jazz recital. And this became influential because the Kandinsky aspect of the piece is solely based off of the visual aspect of the animations you see and the color coordination between all the shapes and all the dimensions. And all of those, the animations weren't done by me. They were done by other animators, which I made sure to credit them in the video posted because they're exceptional at what they do. But really my process for composing has never felt conventional. And I was literally talking about this. So to give another context, I was just in Basel, Switzerland for an audition for grad school, and I presented the same piece. And I remember one of the individuals on the panel was asking me like the whole consensus about tracing my synesthetic connections with Kandinsky. And so the piece ultimately was, and this was the response I gave, it's like I wanted to channel something that didn't feel like it was a conventional way of writing music, because the two different senses between mine and Kandinsky were something that I felt like could really trace this sort of whimsical way of combining music with something external that doesn't directly connect to one's own, I guess, traditional way of writing. Because I don't know if Bach had synesthesia, but I know Franz Liszt he was synesthetic, and Duke Ellington was synesthetic. So,
wow.
So that,
you're teaching me a lot, because I think I might have mentioned this. My friend said Angelo Badalamenti, the guy who scores all of David Lynch, he had a theory that he composed with color in mind. So I went up to Frank Zappa one day after we talked to Angelo at an art opening. I says, "What color is the chord C?" And he goes, "I don't know, red or blue." Yeah, I forgot if he said red or blue. And he says, "Ask Rimsky-Korsakov."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he was synesthetic also.
Right. All. So when you're composing and playing music, how much are you thinking of your audience? Duchamp said there's no art without an audience, but how much do you actually think of your listener when you're writing a song?
It's funny you say that, because I try to not always think about the listener, because I feel like the best way I can say it is like I kind of just like feeling comfortable with the ideas in my own world, that I sort of am in that mindset of like, I don't give a shit who likes it or doesn't like it. And I'm still, of course, after periods of time, it's like, it's sort of the same thing. Like when you go out and perform, it's like, if you're not thinking about who's listening, then kind of just gives your perception of, not thinking about the external things, but focusing solely on the music to have a huge and massive impact in that way. But even with my music, like I pretty much have just learned to just like not always think about the listener at large, because I think there's like there's a moment for me when I'm sucked into my own universe and I get pure enjoyment out of it, that it's like,
Yeah.
if people want to see it for themselves and have an experience, that's great. Or if
Yeah.
not, that's great too, you know?
Yeah, it's funny because Frank Zappa would say, "I write music for myself. If other people like it, it's a bonus." It's like, yeah, Frank, that's over romanticizing, because he knew he's a struggling kid trying to sell his music to record companies, you
Right.
know, and he knows if he hits these notes and sings these lyrics, kids will buy his records, then he can make more music. But
Exactly.
it's all right to say that. And then, Derek Bailey, we talked about him. I saw him at McCabe's years ago, and
My God.
after he clinks around on the guitar for a few minutes, he looks up and goes, "No one's walked out yet." I mean, how much is he really? Because you cannot, I don't think you cannot not think about your audience. And then the other smarty pants people go, "Well, I am my audience." But I'm
Exactly.
saying, besides, you can't separate that you live in a capitalistic consumer society, and you're creating something that potentially can pay your rent, but
Exactly.
you want to be like a pure artist, and like, oh, and I love it, because that's a beautiful thing that you said.
Oh,
Now, McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness, like
mhm.
knife and fork extends our teeth,
Right.
shutter and a camera extends our eyelid, maybe even non-tangible, say religion or philosophy, extends consciousness. What
Sure.
does the guitar extend for you? What humanness?
Oh, man. I mean, with any instrument, there's always a sense of exploration, I think.
Yeah,
I think the cool thing about guitar is that, and you know this especially, everybody's take on it is so unique, and it's not like the same way that you play, you know, any chord or any line. I mean, it's like this is actually one of my oops. This is actually like one of my uncle's guitars, and I've been like really experimenting with it so much, but you know, there's something beautiful about when you're playing any chord that, you know, at least for my case, it's like there's always like there's some kind of embodiment of, pure listening and pure exploration of how, you know, after you touch the instrument, it's like how it resonates is just such a big, clear thing in my case. And having listened to so many guitar players over, I mean, many years, it's like I pretty much just enjoy the essence that people have with how they touch the instrument, how it feels. And
yeah,
these days I'm trying not to think overly about, and I catch myself doing this. It's like, you know, there are ways where people can really show off their chops, but
yeah,
yet, it's like comparing apples and oranges, sort of like, looking at someone like Alan Holdsworth versus
yeah,
like John McLaughlin, you
yeah,
know, both very experienced at what they do, and yet
yeah.
they know how to properly execute what they play. But there's something unique about, their touch and their feel on the instrument. And
That's amazing. So basically, you're saying it extends exploration, resonance, and tactility, touch. I
yeah,
mean, that's really good. And I love you bringing up John and Alan, two of my favorites,
yeah,
because it is it's so amazing how many genres that the guitar covers.
hmm
You know, and so uh, what's the function of music?
oh man, I love this question. And it's cool. I was just about to say too, even going back to guitar, it's like I remember, my dear friend and one of my many mentors, Julian Lodge, just hinting these sort of things on me about just the the philosophy of music and its just direct connection to pure enjoyment. And I think, going back to perception too, it's like there's a beauty of how music can, of course, transform character and And everybody, a lot of people will say how therapeutic music is, and it's really a true thing. Even expanding on that, it's like, Julian would even emphasize to me the things about music that maybe, especially if you're in academia, which, as a scholar of music, you could say, I've noticed that there are things that certainly you can learn from academia about how to be a musician or an artist entirely, but it can't always provide the same amount of humility or understanding as compared to as young as you are when you first learn an instrument. That there's something about that complete joy and fascination when you're just the many times I've sat down with an instrument and just purely like just wanted to figure out things and really create this massive form of curiosity that I think extends the way that I learn music from listening to records and learning from how people perform on stage. And and even Julian would hint this at me too, especially like, the pure enjoyment of actually like experiencing it moment for moment, but not focusing too much on like giving yourself that kind of external validation, but solely just being in the moment and experiencing that with, pure joy and ecstasy is like, there's nothing else like it.
It's like what I hear you saying is the function of music is to make you live in the moment. The great David Moss said it's the sound of being alive.
Right.
And Cage said he learned from his teacher that it's soothe the soul and make it susceptible for divine intervention.
Absolutely.
So you go to Mickey Hart and he said, "Hey, there was a warning system. You hit the log because they're coming to take your food, so you're communicating." And we know a million other functions of music. My favorite also is the great Storm and Norman Zamchek. He says to keep people from going insane.
I mean, honestly, in the world we live in now, I think we need music more than ever.
It is a soothing, healing force. So, when you were talking about John McLaughlin and Alan Holdsworth, I wanted to throw in my friend who does my funk songs with me. He and I have this thing. Is he a chops player or a feelings player? Now, everybody, it's a range, because when Yngwie came out, we said, dude, John McLaughlin did this years ago with a lot more feeling. But, Yngwie was doing Paganini. So he was more of a chops guy, and he was so good, and he still is good. He's great, and he does have feeling. So it's hard to say, oh, he's more a feelings guy or more a chops player. But I would love to play the game with you. Whenever I hear a new guitarist, I just send you the link and go chops or feel, exactly. And just see, because everybody, it goes to them differently. They go, oh, it's not that we, like you said, you're a historian and a scholar of music. That's what we like to do, is talk about music. It doesn't mean, where our opinion is correct.
Right.
So this is Copeland. The 4 elements or ingredients of music are melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color. In non-academic terms, to a normal person, what is tone color?
Oof. That's deep. That's really deep. I mean, I think in terms of tone, I feel like it's universal, because it's, you listen to the tone on a guitar versus the tone on a piano and everything else. There has to be some sort of alignment with the way that tone color is produced in, I guess, in a setting where it feels like you can hear intently with just how the tone color blends together in such a way. But even when you say color, it's like I'm trying not to jump immediately to a synesthetic viewpoint, because that's just my own perception with it.
Yeah.
But like, I think of it, guitarists, they always talk about tone, for instance, and one's tone is different from another person's. It's like,
Yeah.
I mentioned Alan and John, but that's also a different case from someone like Julian versus Peter Bernstein.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
there's something different. Both of them, both Julian and Peter, I love them both to death, but it's also like, their perception of tone on the instrument is so unique to them. And to describe somebody who maybe doesn't know both of them in terms of tone color, it's like, maybe Julian's a more brighter player, or Pete is a much warmer player, or give another example, someone like Jim Hall. I mean,
Yeah.
someone who, of course, had a very distinct tone on the guitar, for instance. Like there's something very unique about, like, their own perception of tone is such a, it's it's distinct to what is unique to them, but it's also, the best way I can describe it to someone else is like, listen to how twangy the guitar is, or how
Yeah.
warm this hollow body sounds, or like how bright can they make their amp, for instance. Like, are they using like a Roland Jazz Chorus, or a Henriksen Blue, or a Fender Twin Reverb? Like all of these aspects, and not to sound overly like a gearhead, but after seeing so many of these guys perform and just getting a sense of what kind of sounds they get, I feel like tone color is always such a unique thing, because it requires you to really listen for those kinds of elements.
Yeah, the word temperature really nailed it. It's the temperature of the sound.
Mm-hmm.
So then it can go visual, bright, yellow, fiery, or
right.
When you said the word warm, that's temperature. Like, but it's funny because you brought up Pete Bernstein, because Tyler Bartram, who does my funk songs with me, when I told him Nadav Peled played on my funk song, he said, yeah, Nadav studied with Pete in New York. No, and Tyler said, "Oh, Pete's the best guitar teacher in New York."
Oh, for real?
I mean, you can second that emotion, yeah. No, so here's the four things, though, Taylor: melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color. How do you approach them? How do you integrate them? How do you interpret them? I mean, is there one you go, I'm a harmony guy? Or, it's a hard question. I've never been able to really get the wording right, because most people go, well, I just integrate all four of them, but is there some way you can talk about how you integrate, especially in composing and playing, melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color?
My goodness. I mean, the best way I can describe it is that it's not always one set thing.
Yeah.
For me, continually, it's spontaneous. And as I mentioned earlier, and this is what I told my jury panel when I was auditioning in Basel, it's like, I don't think my formats of the way I'm utilizing all those characteristics is directly, it's not always the same process every time. And it's sort of funny to say, because I feel like I'm the kind of person that tried out having a practice routine, but solely was more interested in doing things spontaneously and just kind of finding elements for myself of how I'm practicing having good tone on the guitar, or composing with the interdisciplinary way that I write, and kind of just putting all these sort of ideas where it's like, I kind of want to discover what I don't know and apply that to the way that I create. Where
that is smart.
Which is so cool. Like, one of my practices, especially, which is very, like, you could call it super crazy, super weird, but when I was starting to compose my music with synesthetic elements in college, I would use like an online website. I use a website called autodraw.com, which is where, like, they have, like, it's basically like a free, like, drawing software platform where I've created graphic notation scores using that. And I would screen record what I would create on AutoDraw, like when I would perform guitar departmentals at North Texas. And basically screen record myself coloring to the music and
No.
then put it into iMovie or Final Cut Pro. And then when I would display the music and add like audio excerpts, then people would see the visual stuff. It's exactly with everything starts from a dot. I did something similar where, I had like these ideas of what I wanted the music to visually scope out. And eventually, once I did that, the process became so natural to me to add those elements together and then include the visual aspect of my music now. But when
Yeah.
it comes to the all of those things that Copeland is hinting, for me, there's not a set process with it. Because
Yeah.
I do feel like for me, like whenever I pick up the guitar or if I'm sitting at the piano composing or if I'm putting something into auto draw, it's like I don't always think of it like today at this said time I'm going to do said thing. It's sort of
Right.
like this intrinsic like response to want to do it, which that to me I think says more about how you collectively get inspired in the moment versus and people will probably, you know, have different opinions about this because I feel like a practice routine for some people is essential, but I think of it more like I just like the idea of if I feel it, then I do it.
Yeah.
And
That's impulse, intuition. You're really good, Taylor, at tackling these, because when you said you want to apply what you don't know, that's a total McLuhan line. He said, carefully make plans, then do the opposite.
exactly. It's funny because like I felt like I've already made so many plans, like, and I document things.
Yeah.
I always write them down, but then it's like, you know, it used to be like whenever I would come up with an agenda for the week and only get 2 out of say
Right.
7 or 8 things done, I would get pretty like pissed at myself. Like just because it's like, you create an agenda and if
Yeah.
you don't follow through and maybe it's even, coming
Yeah.
as a former perfectionist, it's like, if I didn't nail everything, then therefore, I'm not getting there. But I think it's sort of like after you create routines for yourself, you kind of start learning how to lose them and just
Lose them. You make a list of what you're supposed to do for the day. Then you lose the list and you got the day off. Then
exactly.
you then you start the next day and you put a new list and it says find old list.
Exactly. There's a book. I know there's a book out there called I think it's just called like it's either creative practices or creative agendas. Let me actually
Yeah.
I remember a friend of mine in New York, like he made like a YouTube video of like some books he was reading. But he was like he mentioned one book. I haven't read it all the way
Yeah.
through, but and it has like basically like there's a clock on it and like the
Yeah.
faces of I think it's called like creative agendas or something.
Yeah.
But it
Well,
basically it basically documents like every artist, like what did Maya Angelou do, or what did
yeah.
Duke Ellington do to start his
Yeah.
day, or what did Johann Sebastian Bach do?
Yeah.
If I remember the title correctly, I'm sure it'll.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We can check it out later. But it reminds me of Twyla Tharp too, who did the most amazing.
Mhm.
She becomes the go-to choreographer. Every composer in the world wants to have her do a dance to their music.
Yeah,
And Philip Glass, David Byrne, everybody. Guess
right.
what? For her first 5 years, her dance company,
Mhm.
no music,
Wow.
just dance. See, she knows she's in a bit in a medium that's dependent on music. I'm
Yeah.
going to do it without music. I'm going to do what I don't know so that I can get really good at what I'm doing. So
Mhm.
here's the 3 T's of music, my friends say, are technique, theory, and taste. You've learned how to play guitar. You know
Right.
the structure. How does one acquire taste?
Hmm. That has to be something so unique to every artist. I mean, for me, it's like I think of it solely as simple as it is, just really liking something enough or loving it enough that you want to somehow pull it into your universe.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, I've been super into film composition lately and been trying to really understand, like, and some people, a lot of my teachers hinted this at me, like, Henrik Korngold and, one of my idols, Henry Mancini. I mean, solely I solely wanted to acquire, well, maybe not acquire is the right word, but like I wanted to embody this sort of interest in something that wasn't, of course, directly related to guitar,
Yeah.
um, but I mean, there's some correlation because like it's still harmony, just from a different perspective. So like in the context, especially in my case, writing for strings, for instance, it's like I'm always trying to not have, not in a sense copy what Korngold and what Mancini are doing.
Yeah.
I get so much influence from them, and I go back through Henry Mancini's Sounds and Scores, which is any composer and arranger I know already has the book on their shelf, because it's just
Yeah.
such a nugget of, it's an encyclopedic way of orchestration. But in
Yeah.
my case, it's like, my taste in film composing or guitar or anything musical, even just like, another external thing is I've been collecting field recordings as a
Yeah.
way of composing. So
Yeah.
like one thing I do, and I did this fairly recently, is I I was in San Francisco, and one of my roommates from North Texas was with me. So we were exploring around Golden Gate Park, and I basically, like, as people were walking, there's a small pathway where people walk through. You probably know this if you've been through San Francisco.
Yeah.
It's like directly under the bridge. It's like you hear ongoing traffic going by, and
Yeah.
so I would take my iPhone and literally just record the sounds of traffic, like
Yeah.
going through the Golden Gate Bridge. And even though it's like, it's an iPhone recording, so the quality is not going to be
Yeah.
as well. Maybe it is once you mix it, but it's like, my idea for taste is like, there's something appealing to me about like what I can do taking this recording of, the rhythmic sounds of ongoing traffic and cars passing through Golden Gate Bridge. And that was something that was hinted to me from, like, I have a composer friend that went to Juilliard that kind of gave me this sort of idea about like how I can use any audio, any kind of form of sound to create a musical experience. And
Taylor, who you're touching on there is Tony Schwartz. You know him? You
I
got to
know
go.
him, yeah.
Yeah, he's the guy who recorded Harry Belafonte and Taxi Cab Sounds in New York. He was the first kind of big time audio recording guy of everything, not just music. And then when you brought up music composers, I mean, we could do movie music composers for 8 sessions, but whatever you do, don't listen to Bernard Herrmann or Nina Rhoda.
It's a little too late for that. I mean, like, the Twilight Zone is classic.
But this is a follow-up to the word taste. It's 2 parts, basically.
Okay.
It's McLuhan says song is slowed down speech. The reason cultures have different musical taste is ultimately connected to language difference.
Okay.
So what's your take on that? Is our gamelan music or tuba throat singers, whoever we're listening to, or sounds of the bridge, these different cultural musical tastes are connected to language difference. Is there any thoughts on that?
Oh man, I'm gonna have to like write a op-ed on that question.
I hope you do, because no one ever listens. The first part they go, song is slow down speech, and they go, no, it isn't. But McLuhan's talking a little metaphorically there.
Yeah,
because really, is song slow down speech? No, I mean, I love John Hendricks saying Charlie Parker was the highest form of talking ever created.
It's maybe But he had the highest form of talking because he was all drugged up, and yet he spoke so clearly.
He spoke so clearly. Oh my God. He's on the bandstand. He nods out, and the guy next to him elbows him to play a solo, and he just wakes up and plays the most amazing
Exactly.
solo ever.
Talk about a real wake-up call, if you ask me. And that's how Charlie Parker became the bebop pioneer we all know and love.
Yeah.
But no, but for real, like they say, especially like you see it everywhere. It's like, they say music is language, and
Yeah.
it's still true. Although I feel like everybody's perception of music connected to a language is going to be solely different. It's like I've mentioned it earlier. It's like I think of it more like I don't know if you ever took. I assume you took like college music theory courses at some point in your development, maybe. But
not really, but go ahead. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. But like one thing I gathered was, so like this is something I still like, I haven't thrown out like any of my college like textbooks all about music theory and composition and all that, but I think of it solely like, when you're learning a language you need a reference.
Yeah.
And as you're listening and or viewing and or guess like really scoping out all the details, it's like I said with Mancini's book Sounds and Scores, it's like you have pretty much everything written out, and everything is so it's either concise or it's super structured. There's a lot of build to it. And I mean, if we're talking about like music essentially as a language, it's like it's not always the one cookie cutter way of just learning it. It's the same thing I mentioned even with like me being drawn to field recordings recently.
Yeah.
Like I can gain some sort of language from recording the sounds of cars passing through Golden Gate, and even that creates like a sense of interest because there's something unique about how I'm connecting. Maybe there's a language from each rhythm passing by, or even something that I remember Michael Pizarro hinting at me when I discovered his music was this whole idea of, composing is all about sound. And there is a direct relationship between the things that are directly correlated with sound, despite tonal or atonal. You're still creating an atmosphere of sound that's collective within the way that you're listening and the way that you're learning, which if anybody is more on the avant-garde side, like, Michael Pizarro's background is more directed in the John Cage and Charles Ives kind of style. But like the thing that he hinted at me, especially on along the lines of that, is you can find a direct connection with music and anything. And it's, coming from a background where I was learning tonal music before atonal music, was this sort of open gateway to where I don't need to always focus entirely on the separation. Like there is no separation between the two, between tonal and atonal music. And it's sound universal. It's like it's basically like, what are those things called? Like, you have those charts where it's like you have two sides
and Venn diagram.
Venn diagrams. Yeah. So like it's a Venn diagram where it's like all of music, tonal and atonal, and directly in the middle, there's still direct connection to sound. And that I think
one guy says musicality, because here's the next question, Taylor, because you could flesh it out more. You're doing great. Is what's more fundamental, music or language?
And I would have to say language, because even that's universal. And like this is the one thing I feel like that's even societal. It's like we have genres and we have separation of each classification of music, which is why you go into any record store and you see that every style of music is categorized or it's in certain sections. And it's like I like the idea that music doesn't always have to fall under a certain genre. It's like with what I did at North Texas. Like I did write a Kandinsky piece that was sort of jazz oriented, but the instrumentation was unusual.
Yeah.
So I fall under those kinds of things where it's like language. It's like the same thing when I'm writing a piece. It's like I don't want to call it jazz or classical or
Yeah.
anything along the lines of that. It's like it's language in itself because I'm creating this universe that has a very distinct connection between different correlation and connection of sounds.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe we as a society, or even, you know, each individual has a different sort of classification of how we distinguish music from sound, but and even language. But I feel like language is universal. It's not always verbal. And there's even more distinct connection with things that are not directly spoken. And there's a lot of universal connection, even without thinking about the verbal aspect of it.
You know, that's why Stravinsky gave those lectures that music means nothing. and thank God, I don't know if he hung out with, but the other book I hope that's not on your shelf is Nicholas Slonimsky's book.
I actually have it.
I knew. I figured you knew that one because he is. Have you seen him play the music with an orange on the piano on Johnny?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, you know all that. Okay, so. Tell me an instrumental that makes you laugh.
Oh my goodness. An instrumental.
Because that's funny. How could instrumental music make you laugh when it's laughing comes from kind of more from words, you know?
Oh goodness. Wow. I'm trying to think. Like this might be something I'm sure if I give one answer, I'm sure I'm going to change it, but an instrumental that makes me laugh. I'll have to think about that. I'm sure, like, I'm trying to like go through my mental playlist, and yeah, I'll have to directly connect it to something.
You put it in the chat or put it down in the comments if you ever think of one. But here's the next. You know, Thelonious Monk said there are no wrong notes. Any comment?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Like,
so go ahead.
I mean, like, I feel like this is sort of I have a direct connection with that because, of course, I studied jazz, and you know, there's always this sort of hindrance when it comes from how improvisation is taught. And I like the idea, and this is something I'm going to quote David Reutzstein on, who directs the jazz program at Cal Arts. Like this idea of like using your own notes is such a big thing. And like, and this is not to separate like, you know, what happens in that moment versus like what I got out of North Texas. But, you know, I've noticed over time, like as jazz education has been solely in the stage of like, this is how you teach improvisation. Like it's limiting because you can apply the applications and you can transcribe all these things, these ideas, but yet I think of it more like, and I completely agree with what Dave Reutzstein is implying there. It's like it's simply said, but it's like there's like choosing your own notes really is a pathway of improvisation. And you start to learn, even if like something doesn't sound correct. And I think even Miles or Joe Pass even quoted it too, where it's like you hit a wrong note, it leads you to the next right note or something.
Yeah,
like
that's a Herbie gave that lecture in recent years where he was a teenager playing with Miles and he hit the wrong chord, and Miles looked at him and he knew he hit the wrong chord, and Miles taught him you just integrate it and make like, you know, that's like when we asked Hannah Brooks, who's an amazing boogie woogie pianist, I says, there are no wrong notes, agree or disagree. She goes, no, there's wrong notes. It's just how good you cover it up. but my friend who's the most brilliant artist in Best California, his name's Duggo, he says, Monk heard all the notes Charlie Parker heard, but only decided to play some of them.
Yeah,
so,
right.
wanted to talk about silence because, Miles talked about the space between notes.
Right.
George Clinton says funk is the absence of. And
Mhm.
Monk nailed it. Silence is the loudest sound in the universe.
Oh, yeah.
How do you know how not to play? How do you know when to integrate silence in your composition and when you're soloing? You know,
Mm,
when you're
beautiful.
yeah,
I I mean, the best way I can put it is it's sort of based on intuition for me.
yeah,
Because I usually feel like this is actually something I've been practicing with lately is like when I let notes on the guitar sustain, or if even if it's on the piano, this was something I got after just studying and listening to Julian, where he would always sort of have this really beautiful way of playing something, let it sustain, and then just let the sounds ring out. So for instance, I'll give a little example.
yeah.
So like
You
if
know,
I
you mean just let the sustain go, but then even let the silence go after the sustain? Is that what you're saying?
exactly. So
Yeah,
you sort of just let it you let the sound drown out because there's something beautiful about letting that silence through. So for
yeah,
instance, I picked like just two intervals and just letting that move. There's something very unique about like because the fingers also it's different than a piano where your the sustain, especially because you have a pedal to do that, your fingers solely have more the direct connection to cause silence and movement on the instrument itself. So like
yeah,
in my case, it's like, you know, you can hear how it drowns out so quickly.
yeah.
So Julian sort of hinted at me that there's something beautiful you can make out of silence when you're carefully choosing movement as as a way for you to kind of like distinguish when it can be said or when it can be silent to the point where um and I catch myself doing this especially if I'm trying to play through a tune like sustaining and then just letting it die out is always not die out. I think of it more like there's a way between how you can best let the notes ring out and then like there's beauty in letting it just sort of change the sound quality and then becomes quieter.
Yeah.
Even in a straight ahead tune, for instance, um, like if we're talking like a blues, for instance, which that already created a sense of movement. But unless if I wanted to maybe add an element where it's like I'm already thinking a bit more about how I can collectively make things more silent. Um, like something as simple as just um, creating a sense of improvisation where even if I'm just holding one note, and then like hearing it die out quickly kind of gives this sort of characteristic of having a careful sensibility with silence, but then I catch myself if things are too notey or if I'm adding a little too much embellishment to take away from the actual um the mission of like why I'm trying to be more silent when I improvise.
That's good. The mission, because I called it dynamics to someone. They said, no, it's not dynamics because
Mhm.
this is an artist. He says silence for me, silence is music.
Mm-hmm.
How would you react to that?
I would agree.
Yeah.
It goes back even to, it was like right when I was discovering Michael Pizarro's music. Which, are you familiar with his work at
I'm
all?
gonna look him up as soon as we're done. Yeah, I want to.
Yeah. So Pizarro has a piece actually. I just want to make sure I'm quoting this. Um, so like Pizarro is also a guitarist. He teaches composition at Cal Arts, and he's a very interesting piece where I think it's just, if I remember the name correctly, yeah, it's called Asleep Desert Choir Angus, or yeah, Agnes. It's from 2016. And so in the whole setting, to give context, is you see these whole lines of like desks, and like there's people like writing and scribbling and um basically like doing small tasks. The whole idea of the composition is not that you're listening for something that's tonal, but in the essence of silence, it's like you're creating this sort of, or what Pizarro is doing, sort of giving you this like this sort of perception. And as you're listening, it's like, sure, you're listening to a collection of different sounds, but you don't expect anything tonal because you're listening solely to like people tapping on the wall or scribbling with pencil. Or it's like your own form of silence, at least in Pizarro's case, is not directly connected to tonal music or anything that requires certain pitches, but it's giving you sort of this listening experience, which to some people, especially in the context of something that's more avant-garde or has a very, I guess, unusual outlook on sound, it requires you to listen with intent. And I remember I sent this to a friend of mine who lives out in Germany, because we were talking about like avant-garde music, and like he was telling me that like, I'm gonna have to watch that again because I was sort of spooked out by this composition. It's like, that's good. That's emotion.
That is.
That's pure emotion. So
Yeah.
in summary, it's just like I've been thinking about silence in that way, where even because we think direct. I used to think directly about how silence basically just meant, I could stop talking now and you could just hear background noise, but there's more to it.
There's more to it. Because here's one more silent quote. I'd love to get your reaction. Thomas Carlyle: speech is of time, silence is of eternity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. But it's also, I almost feel like I contradicted a little bit because there's because everybody's form of silence is unique and different, and I mean, we can talk about it a lot about how it correlates with the way that we hear and the way that we listen to music, but there has to be something as unique about, if silence is eternal, are we always thinking it as more or less noise? Like,
Yeah.
I can only imagine, not that it's something I think about daily, but it's like, is death always silent? Or is
Yeah.
how much noise are we collecting before transcendence?
That's heavy, dude, because it really flows perfectly into in 1969, the LA Free Press asked Frank Zappa about Pauline Oliveros. You know this woman, deep listening.
Mhm.
Yeah. And she worked with sound above the audible and below,
Uh-huh.
creating a mass. And they said, Frank, you like this. And this is what Frank Zappa said.
Yeah.
Not that it created a mass, it created something audible. It produced a some indifference tone, which happened to be located within the audible frequency range. By
Uh-huh.
combining something so high you couldn't hear it and
Yeah.
something so low you couldn't hear it, it yields something in the middle you could hear. Whether you like what you heard in the middle or not is another question. The concept is brilliant. So,
Mm.
your take on what Frank is saying, that it didn't it created not a mass, but it created something audible a sum and difference tone
Mm-hmm.
happen to be located within the audible frequency range. What
Hmm.
does that mean, the higher and lower to you?
Hmm. I mean, without sounding direct, I mean, I guess I could give a more direct and an indirect example, but frequencies have always, I like to think of it solely like if you're, you know, this, especially because when you're in a recording studio, you're always measuring every every sound quality possible. If you're recording a band, how the frequencies all line up with each other. And there's especially an important aspect of like, there has to be some mission about like how collectively you can get all the sound all the sound qualities together to match up. It's not like if
Yeah,
you go past like say, I mean, whatever, between 1,000 up to like maybe 10,000 hertz, there's a different case with how that quality is then balanced, even if it's individualistic between an instrument or a vocalist or anything. Like we have this measurement of how hertz are solely lined up, and that's expanded with modern technology and the way that we listen and record. But you know, a more indirect answer for me would be how, as you're listening directly in the middle, like, and I feel like this is something that's been relatable to me over the years because, like, it's so ironic because, like, you know, I love going out to larger cities like San Francisco, for instance, and for some, I usually get like, I don't know if it's more like I don't know if I would call it sensory overload from an autism point of view, but for me, it's like the slightest forms of frequency, if they're that sharp or if they jump out of nowhere, it's like my body has a reaction to it. It's sort of like if someone like, you know, jumps from behind and scares you, you know, like your body has a response to that.
yeah,
Um, so I think of it like if frequencies can determine the way that we perceive sound and motion, then there must also be a there must there must be some kind of correlation between, like, even if we don't distinguish hertz by number or frequencies by numbers, then it's almost like we almost have an internal sense of how when we listen to something that either has like a sharp dynamic or something that's more mellow and easy to listen to, then like it sort of feels like you'll have resonance in the body to feel that.
yeah. Like muscle memory, what makes you comfortable? Back to that word you used earlier, temperature, like warmth
Hmm.
or coldness. This is a question, Taylor. I'm curious your response. Why is 4/4 time the most commonly used time signature in Western music?
Most likely because it's easy. Like it's simple. Like it's interesting because I feel like we gain. I mean, it's just easy for people to listen to,
Yeah,
but it's not to say that like, you know, like listening to anything in 3/4 or 6/8 or even 7/4, like, you know, it became apparent, especially as the contemporaries in jazz were coming out, like they were all experimenting with songs in mixed meter. So like I remember watching a buddy of mine at North Texas, like he would play All the Things You Are in 7, and
yeah,
it's interesting. And I
yeah,
even like I was taking like jazz improvisation courses, and I had to transcribe like solos in 7/4, for instance. Like, but 4/4 I feel like is so easy. It's not complex. It's like it's so basic and vanilla enough that it's easy to follow for everybody.
You
Which
know, this is what someone said. Besides being intuitive and easy, 4/4 time might be because it's in sync with walking,
right.
marching,
Hmm.
and maybe our heartbeat rhythm.
Hmm.
Is the heartbeat in 4/4 time or some other time? What do you think?
Oh man. I mean the way I see it, it's like pulse is certainly a big thing. Not to get overly analytical with this, but I would have to say universally for every person, it's got to be it's got to be different. I could say like my heartbeat would probably be in 7/4 if I'm counting correctly.
Yeah.
But, I'm not opposed to the idea that it would be in 4/4.
Yeah. Well, you've been a performer as well. You know that creating music, you have to be in front of an audience.
Mhm.
This is Ruth Draper. The key is to bring the audience up onto the stage and
Uh-huh.
into the scene with you. It is they who must give you even more than you give them in the way of imagination and creative power. How do you do that, Taylor? How do you bring the audience up onto the stage with you?
Other than calling them out? No. I mean, that's the easy way to do it. But I mean, these days it's like this about me, Gerry. It's like I'm a visual like creator. So
Yeah.
I like to see, not that everybody has to think the same way I do, because nobody can. It's like, but even in this case, it's like bringing people up from the audience in. It's like the simplest way is like, anybody else's form of imagination and projection of how they perceive anything I do is enough. And that to me gives me it's not like, I need to do any extra work to bring my audience into whatever I'm doing, but it solely just means that there's a visual aspect to it in the creative way where like my expectation would be just solely to bring my audience in is solely just like bringing them into my own universe. And
To be yourself, to be Taylor.
exactly.
Taylor, you almost quoted Nadia Boulanger.
Yeah.
You know what she told Quincy Jones?
What's that?
Your music can never be more or less than you are as a human being. So
Hugely.
it goes back to your first answer to my first question, part one. What's the best thing for a human being? To be human.
Exactly.
And so you're saying the way I bring them up on stage, people go eye contact,
Right.
you say I just be myself. So
Exactly.
perfect. But here's Leonard Cohen. The
Mhm.
only way you can sell a concert is if you put yourself at risk. And
Right.
if you don't do that, people know. What
Mhm.
what role does risk play in your creative process?
I feel like risk is everything. It
Yeah.
means, going back to what I was saying about the stuff that I don't know, I'm taking risks to just take the deep plunge to really soak in something. It's
Yeah.
one of the benefits I find being on the spectrum is like I am constantly like wanting to take all sorts of risk with knowing something that I don't know, but also it's even simple like, you know, a risk could be as simple as going up to someone and starting a conversation, which after periods of time it's like there's something about like genuinely like, finding different neurological pathways of trying to get yourself to do something because people say break out of your comfort zone, which for some people it's different, but like I've taken all different sorts of advantages, if for me at least, were, and it's sort of like I've reinforced my psychology to think in a certain way where I'm not only staying in my comfort zone for that long, and I'm still working on it of course, but it's only to the idea of like how I'm utilizing risk as this initiative to push myself further than where I am now. And it works. I think it works in that way if you have the mindset, it's one thing, but it's different from thinking versus doing. Like
Yeah.
what's the name of the book? Like Alan Belkin, the great composer, brought this to my attention. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. And
Yeah.
which I think is like more or less, I think it's like a big name, like New York Times bestseller at this point.
Yeah.
But it's like the whole idea of like this, everybody's conception of thinking is only as universal to how one perceives to really take direct action on one thing and then pursue it. With risk, I feel like it's like if I'm not taking risks, then I'm not progressing, and I'm not, it's sort of like, and I don't know why some educational systems haven't thought about this until like more recently, but it's like, you know, everybody's own sense of failure and falling on their faces. It's like there's something deep and philosophical about that, even as you're taking risks and failing enough times that you finally start to have this sort of extra mold and a new neurological pathway where everything just becomes more easy as you're taking those risks. But here's the funny thing, because I watched a YouTube video recently from one of my favorite authors, the great Mark Manson, who I've mentioned in
Oh yeah,
the
I looked him up. Yeah, I love. I'm glad you turned me on to him. Go ahead.
yeah. So he just made this YouTube video about Charles Bukowski, who,
Oh
yeah. But the whole idea of the video was he was emphasizing how much people try too hard, but Bukowski has always said, don't try.
yeah, don't try. Yeah,
Exactly. And after watching it, it was like, I knew about Bukowski like fairly, but not to the point where I've actually like analyzed his work. But Mark was saying how, like, you know, this dude was totally like beaten up mentally. I mean, he went through some of the craziest shit possible, but yet his own philosophy was solely just like, he didn't try, he just did. And no matter if he got into, you know, how many, like, he went through several marriages, and like he had critics like despise his work and all that. But
he also, Taylor, he's also over romanticizing like Zappa. It's great. Bukowski could be he tried, he knew he was a poet, but he wanted to put it like, I'm just a drunk who works at the post office and writes dirty books. And, his books are the most stolen books in bookstores. Like, the whole story of Bukowski is great. He's very inspiring in articulating that, but there is another side to that, and he got lucky. The guy who started published everything he ever wrote. Half of or 3/4 of it is not that good, but a quarter is, and that's great. A quarter's great. So, he's like, it's fun, and I'm glad. I look forward to watching Mark talk on Bukowski, because it's fun when these guys, because it's like him and Burroughs, they're fucking sick puppies and they become these heroes for young people. And it's like, oh my God. But I'm glad there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm glad that Mark sussed someone out like Bukowski. But I wanted to go, you really tackled the risk question well, Taylor, and I appreciate that, because I want to throw a monkey wrench in there, because everybody says, oh, risk is a big factor. In Napoleon Murphy Brock, who sang on Zappa's greatest albums, Roxy and Elsewhere, all these albums, I asked him, what role does risk play in your creative process? He goes, I leave it in the dressing room. Now, to me, that is amazing, because you don't want to go out on stage and act like Leonard Cohen said. If you don't put yourself at risk, people know that. They want you to show your humanity.
Right.
And show that you're not perfect. Like, my wife's a pro jazz singer. When she messes up on a lyric, she will literally slap herself on stage. Now, that's funny because she's sort of that type, but she could just go on and no one would know she messed up a lyric.
Exactly.
So do you do that to make it feel endearing? So I'm just curious your thought of that in regards to confidence on stage, and it's also really, what is courage? How do you have the courage to utilize risk, and how do you know to have confidence in regards to Napoleon's statement, I leave risk in the dressing room?
Yeah. I feel like this is one of the benefits of having been a jazz musician. It's like improvisation is taking risks, because there's always motives for you to choose your improvisational tactics. But there's also, going back to what Dave Reutzstein was saying too, about like the whole idea of choosing your own notes. It's like, that really is essentially how you get more comfortable with yourself. But
Yeah.
at the same time too, it's like confidence is solely, it's individualistic.
Yeah.
And I feel like for me, it's like, over periods of time, I had to work up how to be confident to go up and speak to people.
Yeah.
Like, because, it's like through periods of time, especially when I was younger, like I had therapy about, just how to build up, like understand social cues and how to try and become so socially facilitated to just casually do it. Because, and this is more or less common with, how it's taught to autistic children, where it's like you practice via conversation and then you sort of, you just learn after periods of time, like this is how you know how you ask the question directly to one person and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Although for me, it was like, I think I just solely built up a lot more confidence in myself because I knew in the mindset, like I sort of just took like internal notes to myself about how to approach and socialize with other people. And
Yeah.
to some extent, it was like, of course, it was all trial and error because, at some point you're going to screw up. And
But does it mean courage? Did it take courage? I mean, what does courage mean in this, what you're talking about?
solely for me, I mean, courage for me has always just kind of having the essence of knowing that I'm going to do it and see what comes out of it. Like,
Yeah.
but although the thing about it is like, the one outcome I would have had is like, oh yeah, I can just be a better socializer the more I talk to people.
Yeah.
Or even in the context of meeting some of my teachers or some of the many musicians who have been impactful in my developments, as simple as just sending them an email introducing myself, which
Yeah.
I've noticed, especially with the younger generation, between mine and some of the younger students I've worked with, like there seems to be some internal anxiety that they have about casually speaking with people who they think are of a high caliber. And it's like,
Yeah.
these days it's like you can literally go up and talk to them and
Amazing.
you find out either way. It's like I actually had one instance with I met Herbie Hancock some years ago now in Anaheim for a NAMM show conference, and he was on his way. Like I think he was like taking one of the main escalators up because he had something, and I to this day I'm very much I'm still somewhat embarrassed that this happened, but like I approached Herbie and like I got a photo with him, and I had like one of my practice journals that I kept with me, and I got him to sign it, and somebody like right behind me had suggested that Herbie signed their like NAMM card, and I I thought I'm like, oh, that would be sweet actually if he could do that for me. And I asked Herbie like, hey, would you be comfortable signing my NAMM badge? And then he looks at me as he's about to walk up the escalator, and he's like, I think you have enough. And hey, I'm like, oh yeah. I like
No, don't worry about that, Taylor. You showed your appreciation to him. He signed one. That's why my friend was bugging Zappa backstage on questions. He goes, Frank turns to him and goes, "No more questions from you, buddy."
oh,
I mean, these guys are human. Let it go. You did. Well, we only got about 5 more minutes, Taylor. That was a
okay.
good story. And I loved how you handled that confidence in leaving risk in the dressing room. But here's the last. We'll end this one, and maybe we can do a part 3. Half a year or a year later when you're a big rock star, and you did your PhD. Did you get accepted to Basel, or they're still waiting?
I'm still I'm waiting. This is for
Yeah.
it's for my master's actually.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I find out from Jazz Campus sometime later this month, which
Well,
we'll
keep
see
me
what happens.
posted. Yeah, we'll
Oh,
see
yeah.
what happens.
If
But
all
this,
goes according to plan, then I'll move to Basel sometime in September, I think.
wow. So maybe a half a year or a year down the road, we'll meet up again. But here's Viola Spolin, who's a very interesting person who
Yeah.
was a social worker in Chicago
Hmm.
who taught role playing and basically invented comedy improv. So
Okay.
she spawned the Groundlings, Saturday Night Live, all the Second City in how to do comedy improv. And
Yeah.
she's a social worker. She
Wow.
said, if the audience cannot see your struggle to achieve something, they cannot root for you to achieve it. What
Ooh, that's
what
deep.
role, yeah, what role does struggle play in your creative process?
Man, I love this question. I've
Yeah.
been thinking about this a lot because, and to give some summary, it's like I had a problem with perfectionism similarly, actually, because I remember I talked with one of my teachers, Larry Coons, about a similar thing. And, you know, his story about it is way different than mine. But struggle for me has solely just been it almost felt like I've had to overcompensate on certain things in order to, get myself to what I thought was a successful career in the arts or music. But these days, it's like struggle, humility, embarrassment, they all apply to some aspect of like just development. But it's also like, I used to be afraid of like, falling flat on my face figuratively and, screwing up on stuff because it's sort of like we are not conditioned to, take on embarrassment and those kinds of feelings the same way we do now because there's now more of a gentler approach to the way that we're looking and seeking humility and just feeling comfortable with it. And of course, going back to some of my teachers and influences, it's like so many of them have hinted at me that you know there's pure realization in the idea that like the struggles you deal with, and in any case it's different for everybody, but despite, because I feel like mine have been more, I guess, internal, just the way my thought process is, but yet I've noticed that to some reason, based on my ideal trajectory and where I'm going, it's like I've noticed that struggle has played a role in the way that I've created or the way that I continue to create, because I think having that sense of humility and understanding and knowing what I want out of my own artistic endeavors is solely, it's deep and personal enough to where if it means, having to go through this economic lifestyle we live in, and how, if it means like, if it doesn't mean winning a Grammy or getting some kind of like award or recognition, I mean, it's art for art's sake.
Yeah.
And pure struggle, I think I've noticed this too. Like some of my greatest and closest friends that are artists are on the spectrum or have some form of neurodiverse outlook. And yet they're not Grammy winners, but still they're great musicians who had to endure so much of the stuff that I had to endure when I was younger. And I applaud them because they're producing art for art's sake at the end of
Yeah.
the day. And I live by that. And
Yeah.
I'm having even it's sort of like having a very strong relationship with struggle is always going to emphasize the how can I say this? Like creative openness to utilize it as a form of experience to enhance creativity.
Yeah. Really good, Taylor, because you brought up that word humility in personal, and it goes back to Nadia Boulanger, to Quincy. Your music can never be more or less than you are as a human being. It's
Right.
just showing your humanness, I asked this one great jazz musician, and he studies how the sounds are killing the uh, fish in the ocean. He's
Oh,
an
really?
amazing person. I says, "What's the best thing for a human being?" And he said, "Gratitude." And it was
Okay.
like, I am so grateful for our time together, Taylor. I really appreciate it. And
Likewise. Thank
I
you.
wish I wish you luck in all your pursuits, man. I don't know if you need it. You're persevering through all this. Like you're like one of those choo-choo trains that you loved as a kid, man. There ain't no stopping the Taylor train, man.
Never, never. Thank you so much, Gerry. As always, it's super fun being here.
Yeah. And we'll be in touch. I'm going to hit the end broadcast button. Like I always say, I hope this never ends and we keep talking forever and ever.
As long as we both live, that's always going to be the mission. And
even in heaven, in the music room, I'll meet you in the back of the music room in heaven, man.
Have your questions ready.
Yeah, we'll finally have a chance to jam together. And as you say, noodle and I'll doodle.
Exactly. Before you jump off too, I remember the book I mentioned earlier is called Daily Rituals.
Daily Rituals. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the book that basically has a collection of like some of the great artists and minds and what they did to create their music. So
yeah, that one. Do you have the author's name there? Or
yeah, it's so Daily Rituals is by Mason Curry.
Oh, Mason Curry. Okay. I'll look it up, dude.
But yeah, there you go.
Thank you so much, Taylor.
Thank you. Appreciate you, Gerry.
All right. We'll see you soon.